March 8, 1943. The cold North Atlantic waters churned beneath the hull of HMS Harvester as she steamed through the darkness, her crew at battle stations. Below the waves, a German U-boat prowled, its commander confident in the deadly game of cat and mouse that had claimed hundreds of Allied ships. The escort destroyer's ASDIC operator called out a contact, his voice tense but controlled. The submarine was close, too close. Within seconds, the U-boat would slip into the sonar's blind spot, that terrifying zone directly beneath the ship where the echo-ranging equipment went deaf. For 2 years, this moment had spelled survival for German submarines. The attacking ship would lose contact, drop its depth charges blindly over the stern, and the U-boat would slip away into the dark Atlantic depths. But on this night, something was different. Mounted on Harvester's foredeck sat a weapon that looked like a porcupine, rows of spigots bristling upward from a steel cradle, 24 projectiles, each weighing 65 pounds loaded and ready. As the submarine entered the blind spot, instead of passing overhead and dropping charges behind, Harvester fired forward. 24 mortars arced through the darkness, splashing into the water 200 yards ahead of the ship. The crew held their breath. Silence. Then a thunderous explosion erupted from the depths. A second detonation followed, then a third. Oil and debris boiled to the surface. U-444 would never return to port. The Hedgehog had claimed another victim, and the balance of power in the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted forever. The story of how this revolutionary weapon came to exist begins not in the Atlantic, but in the desperate spring of 1940. German U-boats were devastating Allied shipping with terrifying efficiency. In the first months of the war, they had sent over 1,000 merchant ships to the bottom, threatening to strangle Britain's lifeline to North America. Winston Churchill would later write that nothing frightened him more during the entire war than the U-boat peril. The existing anti-submarine weapons were primitive and frustratingly ineffective. Depth charges, essentially barrels filled with explosives rolled off the stern of a ship, had to be set to detonate at a specific depth. If the attacking crew guessed wrong, and they usually did, the charge exploded harmlessly away from the submarine. Even when set correctly, the charge had to detonate within about 14 feet of the submarine's pressure hull to cause lethal damage. The odds were terrible. In the first few months of the war, only 5% of depth charge attacks resulted in a submarine sinking. Under normal combat conditions, that figure dropped to 3%. The problem was fundamental and seemed impossible to solve. Sonar, called ASDIC by the British, worked by sending out a ping of sound and listening for the echo to return. The speed of sound in water meant that when a submarine got too close to the attacking ship, the time it took for the echo to return became too short for a human operator to distinguish it from the original ping. The sounds merged into what operators called an instantaneous echo. At that moment, the submarine became invisible. A skilled U-boat commander knew exactly when this would happen. He would wait for the attacking ship to lose contact, then execute a sharp turn, changing course and depth. When the ship passed overhead and dropped its depth charges, the submarine would be somewhere else entirely. Even worse, those depth charges, whether they hit or missed, created massive underwater explosions that disturbed the water for up to 15 minutes. During that time, sonar was useless. Clouds of bubbles, thermoclines disrupted by the blasts, and the sheer violence of the explosions rendered the equipment deaf. A submarine could use those precious minutes to escape, diving deep or running on electric motors to a new position. Into this seemingly hopeless situation stepped a Canadian-born chemist named Charles Frederick Goodeve. In 1940, Goodeve was working for the Royal Navy's newly formed Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, an organisation so unconventional that it was nicknamed the Wheezers and Dodgers. The DMWD, as it was officially known, had been created specifically to think outside the box, to develop weapons and countermeasures that the traditional naval establishment would never consider. Goodeve understood the depth charge problem with crystal clarity. If you couldn't maintain sonar contact during an attack, you were essentially fighting blind. The solution was obvious in theory but seemed impossible in practice. Fire the weapons forward, ahead of the ship, while you still had sonar contact. Let the submarine come to the weapons instead of trying to drop the weapons on the submarine. The concept wasn't entirely new. The Royal Navy had experimented with a forward-throwing weapon called the Fairley before the war, but it had been a spectacular failure. The idea was considered viable in principle, but the technical challenges seemed insurmountable. Goodeve's team began working on the problem in earnest in the spring of 1940. They needed a weapon that could throw multiple projectiles forward, creating a pattern that would increase the odds of hitting a maneuvering submarine. The projectiles had to sink faster than depth charges to reduce the time the submarine had to evade. They had to be armed with contact fuses that would detonate only on impact with the submarine's hull, conserving the explosive force instead of dissipating it through water. And critically, if they missed, they had to sink silently to the bottom without exploding, so sonar contact wouldn't be lost. Every one of these requirements presented enormous engineering challenges. Contact fuses for underwater weapons didn't exist. The projectile had to survive the shock of being fired from a mortar, the impact with the water, and the pressure of sinking to potentially 700 feet, all while remaining safe to handle and reliable enough to detonate when it finally struck something solid. The shape of the projectile was equally critical. When it hit the water, it couldn't tumble or slide horizontally. It had to orient itself vertically and sink straight down, creating a predictable pattern. After months of experimentation, Goodeve's team hit upon a design. They would use a spigot mortar, a weapon concept developed between the wars by Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker. Instead of launching the projectile from inside a tube like a conventional mortar, a spigot mortar used a steel rod fixed to the base plate. The projectile had a hollow tail that fitted over this spigot, and the propelling charge was contained in the tail. When fired, the explosion drove the projectile up and off the spigot. This design allowed a single launcher to fire projectiles of different sizes and weights, and it was mechanically simple, crucial for mass production in wartime. The projectile itself evolved through dozens of iterations. The final design was 7.2 inches in diameter, with a bulbous head containing the explosive and a long finned tail. The head was shaped to create hydrodynamic stability, forcing the projectile to right itself and sink vertically after water entry. The explosive charge was 35 pounds of Torpex, a mixture more powerful than TNT that would become standard in British weapons. The contact fuse was a marvel of engineering simplicity. It had to remain safe during handling and firing, arm itself only after entering the water, and then detonate reliably on contact with a submarine hull. The solution was elegant. The fuse used a spring-loaded striker held in place by a water-soluble plug. When the projectile hit the water, the plug began to dissolve. After about 8 seconds, enough time for the projectile to clear the surface and begin sinking, the striker was released and armed. Any impact with a solid object after that point would drive the striker into a detonator, setting off the main charge. By May 1941, a prototype was ready for testing. HMS Westcott, a destroyer, was fitted with the first operational Hedgehog mount at Portsmouth. The standard mounting held 24 projectiles arranged in 4 rows of 6, mounted on a steel cradle that could be aimed by matching it to the ship's course. When viewed from above, the empty spigots resembled the spines on a hedgehog's back, and the name stuck. The initial trials were conducted against a submerged wreck in Liverpool Bay. The weapon functioned perfectly. The projectiles fired in a rippling sequence, arcing over the bow and splashing into the water in an elliptical pattern, about 140 feet long and 120 feet wide. They sank at a rate of 24 feet per second, 3 times faster than the standard depth charge. A submarine at 200 feet depth would be reached in less than 10 seconds. The pattern was designed so that a submarine within it would almost certainly be hit by multiple projectiles. The mathematics were compelling. A Type 7 U-boat, the most common German submarine, was 220 feet long and 20 feet wide. The Hedgehog pattern covered an area large enough that if the submarine was anywhere within it, at least 2 or 3 projectiles would strike home. And unlike depth charges that required near-perfect placement, a single Hedgehog hit was almost always fatal. The contact detonation meant all the explosive energy was transmitted directly into the submarine's hull, not dissipated through water. The Admiralty authorised immediate production. By the end of 1941, Hedgehogs were being fitted to convoy escorts throughout the fleet. The installation typically required removing a ship's forward gun mount to make room for the launcher, a sacrifice that some traditional-minded officers resisted. But as the weapon proved itself, that resistance evaporated. The United States Navy, desperate for effective anti-submarine weapons, adopted the Hedgehog through reverse Lend-Lease in late 1942. American shipyards began fitting the weapon to destroyer escorts, the small, mass-produced warship specifically designed for convoy protection. By 1943, hundreds of Allied escorts carried the Hedgehog, but having the weapon and using it effectively were two different things. The early combat results were disappointing. Ships equipped with Hedgehog launched attacks so rarely that the Admiralty issued a directive in early 1943 ordering captains to report why they hadn't used the weapon when they made sonar contact. The reasons were revealing. Crews lacked confidence in the unfamiliar weapon. Depth charges, for all their ineffectiveness, provided psychological reassurance. They made a spectacular explosion. You knew you'd done something. The Hedgehog, when it missed, was silent. To crews conditioned by years of depth charge warfare, that silence felt like failure. Additionally, the Hedgehog required a different attack approach. Instead of racing in at high speed and passing over the submarine, the attacking ship had to slow down, establish precise tracking and fire while still maintaining sonar contact. This felt counterintuitive and vulnerable to crews trained in the aggressive sprint and drop tactics of depth charge attacks. The breakthrough came when the DMWD sent an officer to the escort base at Londonderry, where Atlantic convoy escorts were based. He conducted intensive training sessions, explaining the weapon's advantages and sharing detailed accounts of successful attacks. He emphasized that the silence after a miss was actually an advantage, not a failure, because it meant you could immediately set up another attack without waiting for the water to calm. The training worked. By mid-1943, Hedgehog usage rates began to climb, and with them, kill rates. The statistics told an extraordinary story. Out of 5,174 depth charge attacks during the war, British forces achieved 85.5 kills, a ratio of 60 to 1. The Hedgehog, by contrast, made 268 attacks and achieved 47 kills, a ratio of less than 6 to 1. By the end of the war, the success rate would improve even further. On average, 1 in every 5 Hedgehog attacks resulted in a submarine sinking, compared to fewer than 1 in 80 for depth charges. The Hedgehog was more than 10 times as effective. The impact on U-boat operations was immediate and devastating. German submarine commanders had developed tactics specifically to exploit the depth charge's weaknesses. They knew exactly when they would enter a ship's sonar blind spot. They practiced the evasive maneuvers that would carry them away from where depth charges would fall. Suddenly, none of that worked anymore. U-boat war diaries from 1943 onward show a marked change in tone. Encounters with Hedgehog-equipped escorts were described with genuine fear. One commander wrote that the forward-throwing weapons meant there was no blind spot to hide in, no moment of invisibility to exploit. The submarine remained under attack from the moment of detection, until either it was sunk or the escort broke off. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical. Depth charge attacks, while terrifying, had predictable patterns. You heard the destroyer overhead, counted the charges as they fell, felt the shock waves getting closer or farther away. You could track what was happening and maintain some sense of control. Hedgehog attacks were different. The submarine crew would be listening to the destroyer tracking them on sonar, and then suddenly, without warning, contact-fuzed explosions would erupt around them. There was no countdown, no warning splashes, just instant catastrophic detonation if a projectile struck home. The weapon proved equally devastating in the Pacific theatre. In May 1944, USS England, a destroyer escort, was part of a hunter-killer group searching for Japanese submarines in the waters north of the Admiralty Islands. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese messages revealing that 7 submarines were being deployed in a patrol line to intercept American fleet movements. On May 19th, England made sonar contact with I-16, a large Japanese submarine on a supply run to Bougainville. The destroyer escort's captain, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, began his attack run. The first Hedgehog salvo missed. Pendleton maintained sonar contact and fired again. Another miss. He fired a third time, then a fourth. I-16's commander was skilled, maneuvering his submarine to avoid the falling patterns, but Pendleton was patient and methodical. He had the advantage of continuous sonar tracking. The submarine couldn't escape, it could only maneuver within the cone of detection. At 2:33 in the afternoon, Pendleton fired his 5th Hedgehog salvo. 4 to 6 detonations erupted from the depths, followed seconds later by a massive internal explosion as I-16's pressure hull ruptured. The destroyer's stern was lifted by the blast, knocking crewmen off their feet. Debris began surfacing 20 minutes later, and by the next day a 3x6-mile oil slick marked the submarine's grave. It was just the beginning. Over the next 12 days, USS England would accomplish something unprecedented in naval warfare. On May 22nd, she sank Japanese submarine RO-106. The next day, May 23rd, she sank RO-104. May 24th brought RO-116. 3 submarines in 3 days. Her division commander, thinking England's streak couldn't possibly continue, directed other ships in the hunter-killer group to make the attacks on the next contact. USS George and USS Raby made 8 Hedgehog attacks on RO-108 and missed every time. Finally, the frustrated division commander radioed the famous order. "Oh, hell! Go ahead, England." Pendleton brought his ship in and fired. 6 to 10 detonations at 8:34 in the morning, followed by the sounds of a submarine breaking apart. RO-108 was gone. On May 26th, England sank RO-105. 6 submarines in 12 days. It was and remains the most successful anti-submarine campaign by a single ship in history. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, sent a message to England. There will always be an England in the United States Navy. The ship earned a Presidential Unit Citation, and when she was finally decommissioned after being damaged by a kamikaze in 1945, the Navy kept its promise. A new ship, a guided missile cruiser, was commissioned as USS England in 1963. England's success wasn't luck or exceptional skill alone. It was the Hedgehog system working exactly as designed. Each attack maintained sonar contact throughout, allowing Pendleton to adjust his approach based on the submarine's maneuvers. The fast sink rate of the projectiles gave the Japanese submarines minimal time to evade, and the contact fuses meant that even a single hit was lethal. The technical specifications of the Hedgehog revealed why it was so effective. Each projectile was 46.5 inches long and 7.2 inches in diameter. The 35-pound Torpex charge was specifically sized to penetrate a submarine's pressure hull. Post-war examination of submarines sunk by Hedgehog showed that a single hit typically created a hole about 2 feet in diameter, instantly flooding the pressure hull and causing catastrophic failure at depth. The launcher could fire all 24 projectiles in about 10 seconds. The ripple fire sequence was carefully timed to ensure proper spacing of the pattern. Fire them all simultaneously, and they would interfere with each other in flight. Fire them too slowly and the ship's forward motion would compress the pattern. The 10-second sequence was optimal. The projectiles landed in an elliptical pattern, with the Mark 10 version creating an ellipse 140 feet by 120 feet at a range of 200 yards. The Mark 11 version, introduced later, created a circular pattern 200 feet in diameter at about 190 yards. Different variants were developed for different applications. The Mark 15, introduced in 1944, was mounted on a platform adapted from a quadruple 40mm Bofors gun mount. This version could be trained and elevated more flexibly and could be fired remotely from the ship's plotting room. Split Hedgehog versions with 12 projectiles on each side of the bridge were developed for smaller ships where removing the forward gun wasn't feasible. The reload time was about 3 minutes under good conditions, though in the North Atlantic, with icy spray sweeping the deck and the ship rolling heavily, it could take much longer. But 3 minutes was still far faster than repositioning after a depth charge attack and waiting for the water to settle enough for sonar to work again. The ammunition loading process was carefully choreographed. Each projectile had to be fitted onto its spigot with the contact fuse properly installed and the safety cap in place. Crews became expert at this ballet, working in all weather conditions to keep the weapon ready. One of the Hedgehog's most important but least appreciated features was what happened when it missed. Nothing. The projectiles sank silently to the ocean floor, their contact fuses requiring impact with something solid to detonate. This meant the attacking ship could immediately fire another salvo without losing sonar contact. In a typical engagement, a destroyer might fire 3 or 4 salvos in quick succession, adjusting aim based on the submarine's movements, all while maintaining continuous tracking. Compare this to depth charge attacks, where after dropping a pattern, the ship had to wait 10 to 15 minutes for the water to calm enough for sonar to work again. During that time, a submarine could move a mile or more, forcing the attacking ship to reacquire the target from scratch. Many submarines survived simply by outlasting their attackers. enduring hour after hour of depth charging until the escort's ammunition was exhausted, or the convoy had moved too far away to leave it unprotected. The Hedgehog changed that calculus completely. Now, once detected, a submarine remained under continuous attack until it was sunk or until it reached depths beyond the Hedgehog's effective range. And that depth limitation was considerable. The projectiles were effective to depths of about 400 feet under normal circumstances, though successful attacks had been made on submarines as deep as 700 feet. German Type 7 U-boats had a test depth of about 750 feet, but going that deep meant moving slowly to avoid making noise that would give away their position. Most importantly, it meant they couldn't attack. A submarine forced deep by a persistent Hedgehog-equipped escort was effectively removed from the battle. The weapon's development hadn't been without challenges. The original contact-fuzed design was too sensitive, occasionally detonating on impact with large fish or debris. This was fixed by adjusting the striker spring tension and adding a delay mechanism. Weather was another challenge. Heavy North Atlantic swells could swamp the launcher, and subsequent attempts to fire from the soaked mounting often resulted in electrical circuit failures and incomplete patterns. This was addressed by improved weatherproofing and drain systems. The weapon's mounting also presented challenges. The standard Hedgehog launcher weighed several tons and had to be mounted high on the foredeck for clearance. This affected a ship's stability, particularly on smaller escorts. Naval architects solved this by adding ballast low in the ship to compensate, though some smaller vessels could never be adapted to carry the weapon. For these ships, the Americans developed Mousetrap, a rocket-powered version that generated less recoil and required less robust mounting. Mousetrap fired fewer projectiles, only 8 instead of 24, but it was better than nothing for small patrol craft. The Germans responded to the Hedgehog threat in several ways. They accelerated development of acoustic torpedoes like the Falk, which could be fired without raising a periscope, giving U-boats a chance to strike without fully revealing their position. They fitted U-boats with rubber coatings designed to absorb sonar pings, though this proved marginally effective at best. They also issued directives for submarines to go deeper faster when detected, but this limited their operational effectiveness. Perhaps most tellingly, German naval intelligence reports on the Hedgehog showed a progression from dismissive to alarmed. Early reports described it as a curiosity, a forward-throwing weapon with limited utility. By 1944, reports acknowledged that it was among the most dangerous anti-submarine weapons in service, responsible for a disproportionate number of U-boat losses. British intelligence, reading decoded German signals, noted that U-boat commanders were specifically mentioning Hedgehog-equipped escorts in their situation reports, warning other submarines to avoid these vessels if possible. The weapon's success led to further development. In late 1943, the Royal Navy introduced Squid, an even more advanced forward-throwing weapon. Squid fired 3 large depth charges in a triangular pattern, with the charges fused to detonate at the submarine's last known depth based on automatic updates from the sonar system. Squid was more complex and expensive than Hedgehog, but proved even more deadly, with a success rate approaching 1 in 4 attacks. The Americans preferred Hedgehog, partly because of its simpler design and partly because American sonar operating practices were already highly effective. British crews, with their longer experience in anti-submarine warfare, preferred Squid's larger charges and automatic depth setting. Both weapons represented the same fundamental breakthrough, maintaining sonar contact during attack. By 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic had been decisively won, and the Hedgehog deserved significant credit for that victory. More than 500 Allied ships were equipped with the weapon by war's end. It had accounted for dozens of confirmed U-boat kills, and its presence aboard escorts forced German submarines to operate more cautiously, limiting their effectiveness even when they weren't directly engaged. The post-war analysis of anti-submarine warfare consistently highlighted the Hedgehog as one of the critical technologies that turned the tide. Combined with improved sonar, radar, long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers, and most importantly the breaking of German naval codes, the Hedgehog helped create an environment where U-boats went from hunters to hunted. The human element cannot be overlooked. The crews who operated these weapons did so under extraordinarily difficult conditions. North Atlantic convoy duty meant weeks at sea in terrible weather, constant vigilance against submarine attack, and the knowledge that if your ship was torpedoed, Survival in the frigid water was measured in minutes. The men who loaded, aimed, and fired the Hedgehog did so, knowing that their effectiveness meant the difference between their ship and others making it home safely. The training these crews received improved steadily throughout the war. Early in the conflict, many operators had only cursory familiarity with the weapon. By 1944, training programs included detailed classroom instruction, practical exercises with training rounds, and in some cases live-fire exercises against moored hulks. Operators learned to read sonar displays, understand submarine maneuvers, and time their shots to account for the target's movement and the projectile's flight time. The psychological transformation in escort crews was as significant as the tactical one. In 1941 and 1942, convoy escorts often felt helpless against U-boat wolf packs. They could detect submarines but struggled to kill them. The arrival of Hedgehog changed that. Crews knew they had a weapon that worked, that gave them a real chance to destroy a submarine that attacked their convoy. This confidence translated into more aggressive tactics, more persistent pursuit, and ultimately more U-boats on the bottom of the Atlantic. There were stories of extraordinary persistence. HMS Lagan tracked a U-boat for 17 hours in March 1944, firing Hedgehog salvo after salvo, reacquiring sonar contact each time, until finally, on the 19th attack, multiple detonations signalled a kill. The submarine was U-1013, and it never had a chance to escape because Lagan never lost sonar contact long enough for it to slip away. Another engagement, this one involving HMS Bazley in July 1944, demonstrated the weapon's lethality. Bazley fired a single Hedgehog salvo at U-742. 2 projectiles struck home. The submarine surfaced immediately, its crew abandoning ship, but it sank before they could all escape. 49 men died. The entire engagement, from first sonar contact to sinking, lasted less than 20 minutes. The statistical improvement in anti-submarine warfare effectiveness between 1942 and 1945 was dramatic. In 1942, Allied forces sank about 90 German U-boats. In 1943, that number rose to nearly 250. In 1944, it was 240. The Germans were losing submarines faster than they could build them, and crucially, faster than they could train competent crews to man them. By 1945, the average German submarine crew had minimal training and experience, while Allied escorts were manned by veterans who had been hunting U-boats for years. The technological advantages had combined with experience to create overwhelming superiority. The Hedgehog was part of an integrated system. Improved radar allowed escorts to detect surface submarines at night. Better sonar, including forward-looking types, gave earlier and more precise detection. Escort carriers provided air cover in the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. High-frequency direction finding allowed escorts to locate U-boats by their radio transmissions. Breaking the German naval codes meant convoys could be routed around known submarine positions, and hunter-killer groups could be directed to intercept U-boats before they reached convoy routes. But when an escort made contact with a submarine, when the moment of combat arrived, the Hedgehog was the weapon that turned detection into destruction. Its combination of maintained sonar contact, rapid engagement, contact-fused lethality, and quick follow-up capability made it the deadliest anti-submarine weapon of the war. The economic impact was staggering. Every merchant ship that made it safely across the Atlantic carried supplies that kept Britain in the war and built up forces for the eventual invasion of Europe. Every U-boat sunk meant one less submarine hunting those convoys. By 1944, the Germans had effectively lost the Battle of the Atlantic. They continued fighting, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies shipped millions of tons of supplies across the Atlantic to prepare for D-Day. The invasion fleet crossed the English Channel virtually unmolested by U-boats. This was possible only because the U-boat threat had been neutralised, and the Hedgehog had played a crucial role in that neutralisation. After the war, Charles Goodeve received recognition for his work on the Hedgehog and other weapons. He was awarded the Order of the British Empire and continued working in naval research and development. Later in life, he became interested in operational research and worked to extend its applications beyond military problems. He died in 1980, by which time the Hedgehog had been largely replaced by more advanced weapons like homing torpedoes. But during the critical years of 1942 to 1945, the weapon he had helped develop saved countless lives and ships. The U-boats that would have sunk those ships remained on the bottom of the Atlantic instead, victims of a weapon that had seemed impossible to create, but had proven devastatingly effective. The preserved Hedgehog launchers in naval museums today stand as monuments to that achievement. The National Museum of the US Navy in Washington displays one, as does the USS Slater, a preserved destroyer escort in Albany, New York. They look deceptively simple, these arrays of steel spigots on a rotating mount. Nothing about them suggests the revolutionary nature of what they represented, but to the men who operated them, and to the U-boat crews who faced them, they were instruments of precision and terror. The Hedgehog had solved a problem that had seemed unsolvable. It had taken the blind guesswork out of anti-submarine warfare and replaced it with continuous tracking and engagement. It had turned the hunter into the hunted, giving merchant ship crews a fighting chance to survive the Atlantic crossing. When historians analyse the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, they typically point to May 1943, when U-boat losses spiked dramatically, and German Admiral Karl Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from North Atlantic convoy routes. Multiple factors contributed to that turning point. The closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap, improved radar, better sonar, increased numbers of escorts, and crucially, the breaking of German naval codes. But woven throughout those factors was the Hedgehog, giving escorts the ability to turn sonar contacts into confirmed kills. The weapon saw continued service after World War II, particularly with Commonwealth navies. The Royal Navy used Hedgehogs into the 1950s, when they were replaced by squid and then limbo mortars. The US Navy retained Hedgehog-equipped ships into the early Cold War, before transitioning to rocket-launched weapons like ASROC and eventually to air-dropped or ship-launched homing torpedoes. The principle the Hedgehog established, forward-throwing weapons that maintained sonar contact during attack, became fundamental to anti-submarine warfare doctrine. Every subsequent development in anti-submarine weapons, from squid to modern rocket-launched torpedoes, built on that principle. The Soviet Union developed its own version, the RBU series of rocket launchers, which remained in service well into the 21st century. These weapons fired multiple rockets in a pattern, much like the Hedgehog, though they used rocket propulsion instead of mortar-like spigot launching. The technological lineage from Hedgehog to modern systems is clear and direct. Today's anti-submarine warfare relies primarily on homing torpedoes, either air-dropped from helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft or launched from surface ships and submarines. These weapons represent the ultimate expression of the Hedgehog's core insight: maintain contact with the target until the weapon impacts. A homing torpedo is essentially a Hedgehog projectile with its own sonar and propulsion, actively pursuing its target instead of relying on being aimed into the right position. But in 1941, when Charles Goodeve and his team were designing the Hedgehog, homing torpedoes were science fiction. They had to work with the technology available: mechanical fuses, simple explosives, and spigot mortars developed for entirely different purposes. That they succeeded in creating such an effective weapon from these components speaks to their ingenuity and the pressure of wartime necessity. The human cost of the submarine war was appalling. Germany lost approximately 30,000 submariners during World War II, about 3/4 of all men who served in U-boats. The Allied merchant marine lost about 30,000 British, plus thousands more from other nations. The Royal Navy and other Allied navies lost thousands more sailors on escorts and warships. Every ship that the Hedgehog helped protect represented lives saved. Every U-boat it helped sink meant fewer merchant ships torpedoed, fewer sailors drowning in oil-covered water, fewer cargoes lost. The mathematics of attrition had favoured the Germans early in the war. They could build submarines faster than the Allies could build merchant ships, and they were sinking ships faster than replacement crews could be trained. By 1943, that equation had reversed. The Allies were building ships faster than U-boats could sink them, and sinking U-boats faster than Germany could replace them. The Hedgehog was part of the reason for that reversal. In the Pacific theatre, though submarines played a different role, the Hedgehog proved equally valuable. American submarines devastated Japanese merchant shipping, but Japanese submarines also posed a threat to American logistics, particularly early in the war. The Hedgehog-equipped destroyer escorts that hunted Japanese submarines protected the vast logistical network that sustained American forces across the Pacific. The 6 submarines USS England sank in May 1944 would have intercepted American fleet movements, reported positions, possibly attacked aircraft carriers or transports. Instead, they became cautionary tales about the lethality of American anti-submarine warfare. The ripple effects of their destruction extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese submarine commanders became more cautious, less willing to take risks, reducing their effectiveness even when they survived. The story of the Hedgehog is ultimately a story about how technology, properly applied, can overcome seemingly insurmountable problems. In 1940, the depth charge's ineffectiveness appeared to be an unavoidable limitation of anti-submarine warfare. Submarines were inherently difficult to detect and harder to kill. The blind spot when they got close seemed like a law of physics, not something that could be engineered around. But Goodeve and his team at the DMWD looked at the problem differently. Instead of accepting the limitations, they redesigned the weapon system to eliminate them. Fire forward instead of backward. Use contact fuses instead of preset depth. Create a pattern that increases hit probability. Sink faster to reduce evasion time. Each of these innovations seems obvious in retrospect, but they required breaking free from years of established doctrine and practice. The resistance the Hedgehog faced within the Royal Navy establishment demonstrates how difficult that kind of innovation can be. Officers who had spent decades perfecting depth charge tactics saw the new weapon as a criticism of their methods. Ships' captains didn't want to sacrifice gun mounts for an unproven weapon. Training establishments resisted changing their curricula. It took a combination of clear technical superiority, advocacy from progressive officers, and ultimately a demonstration for Prime Minister Churchill himself to overcome that resistance. Once it was proven in combat, adoption accelerated rapidly, but those early months of institutional skepticism cost lives and ships. The DMWD's informal structure and willingness to pursue unconventional ideas proved crucial. A more traditional research organisation might never have developed the Hedgehog, or might have spent years in testing and refinement that the war didn't allow time for. The Wheezers and Dodgers, as they were affectionately known, could move quickly, take risks, and push ideas through that would have been smothered in bureaucracy elsewhere. This organisational lesson is as important as the technical one. Innovation often requires organisations that can operate outside normal constraints, at least in the early stages. The collaboration between British and American forces on the Hedgehog also demonstrates the value of Allied cooperation. The Americans adopted the British weapon without trying to reinvent it, simply licensing the design and putting it into production. American industrial capacity meant that Hedgehogs could be manufactured in large numbers and fitted to the hundreds of destroyer escorts being built in American shipyards. This pragmatic approach, using the best available technology regardless of origin, gave the Allies a significant advantage over the more insular Axis powers. The training programs developed for Hedgehog operators represented another kind of innovation. Early results were poor because crews didn't understand or trust the weapon. Simply mounting it on ships wasn't enough. The DMWD's decision to send training officers to operational bases to conduct hands-on training with real operators facing real combat proved crucial. These officers didn't just teach the mechanics of loading and firing. They explained why the weapon worked, showed examples of successful attacks, built confidence in its effectiveness. This investment in training paid enormous dividends in improved combat performance. The maintenance and reliability of the Hedgehog was another area where careful engineering made a difference. Anti-submarine warfare happened in terrible conditions. North Atlantic storms, freezing spray, salt corrosion, ships rolling violently. Weapon systems that worked perfectly in calm weather testing often failed in real operational conditions. The Hedgehog's designers understood this and built in redundancy and simplicity. The launcher had few moving parts. The projectiles were robust, designed to survive rough handling. The electrical firing system had backups. This attention to operational reliability meant the weapon worked when it was needed, which is the ultimate test of any military system. The tactical flexibility the Hedgehog provided proved as valuable as its technical capabilities. Escort commanders could adapt their tactics to different situations. Against a submarine detected at long range, they could close in and fire multiple salvos, adjusting based on the target's movements. Against a submarine detected close aboard, they could fire immediately without maneuvering. If a submarine crash-dived to evade aircraft, an escort could be on station to greet it with a Hedgehog attack before it could go deep. This flexibility stood in stark contrast to depth charges, which required specific approach patterns and speeds. Changing tactical situations often meant a depth charge attack had to be broken off and restarted, giving the submarine time to evade. The Hedgehog allowed escorts to maintain pressure continuously, to adapt on the fly, to take advantage of fleeting opportunities. The psychological warfare aspect shouldn't be underestimated. German U-boat crews faced terror from Hedgehog attacks that went beyond the physical danger. The unpredictability, the inability to hear the weapons coming, the knowledge that they couldn't hide in the blind spot, all contributed to a growing sense that the ocean wasn't safe anymore. War diaries and post-war interviews with U-boat survivors consistently mention the dread inspired by forward-throwing weapons. This psychological pressure translated into tactical caution, reduced effectiveness, and lower morale. A frightened submarine crew makes mistakes, breaks off attacks prematurely, surfaces when they should stay down. The Hedgehog contributed to creating that fear. The story comes full circle with USS England's remarkable 12-day patrol in May 1944. Here was a weapon system conceived in a British laboratory, manufactured in American factories, operated by American sailors, proving its worth in the Pacific theater against Japanese submarines. The 6 kills represented the culmination of years of development, testing, training, and operational refinement. Each attack demonstrated a different aspect of the Hedgehog's capabilities. The persistence required to make 5 attacks on I-16 before achieving a kill showed that maintaining sonar contact made persistence possible. The rapid succession of kills against RO-106, RO-104, and RO-116 demonstrated tactical efficiency. The ability to succeed where other ships had failed against RO-108 proved that skill in using the weapon mattered as much as the weapon itself, and the final kill of RO-105 confirmed that England's streak was not luck, but systematic application of superior technology and tactics. Admiral King's message, promising there will always be an England in the US Navy, recognised not just the ship's achievement, but what it represented: the transformation of anti-submarine warfare from desperate defence to systematic destruction. When the last U-boat surrendered in May 1945, when the surviving Japanese submarines surfaced and hoisted black flags of surrender 3 months later, the Hedgehog could claim part of the credit for those victories. It had arrived at a crucial moment when the submarine threat seemed unstoppable and had provided a tool that turned the tide. More than 70 years later, the principles it established remain fundamental to anti-submarine warfare. The requirement to maintain contact during attack, the value of pattern weapons that increase hit probability, the importance of fast-sinking weapons that reduce evasion time, the lethality of contact-fuzed explosives, all these lessons learned from the Hedgehog continue to shape how navies fight submarines. The preserved examples in museums are more than artifacts. They're evidence of human ingenuity under pressure, of the ability to identify a problem, design a solution, and implement it at scale when everything depends on getting it right. In the context of World War II, that solution helped save Britain from starvation, protected the logistical build-up for D-Day, and neutralised one of Nazi Germany's most dangerous weapons. March 8, 1943, HMS Harvester's successful attack on U-444 was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of the end for the U-boat force. Within weeks, similar scenes were playing out across the Atlantic. Hedgehog-equipped escorts were turning sonar contacts into confirmed kills with a regularity that shocked German naval headquarters. The weapon that looked like a porcupine had proven to be one of the most lethal instruments in the Allied arsenal. The thunder of its detonations marked not just the destruction of individual submarines, but the breaking of Germany's attempt to starve Britain into submission. The men who loaded the projectiles, aimed the launchers, and held their breath waiting for detonations were ordinary sailors doing an extraordinary job with a weapon that gave them a chance to win. The U-boat crews who faced those attacks were equally ordinary men, fighting for their country and dying in crushed steel cylinders at the bottom of the ocean. The Hedgehog didn't make war less terrible. It made one side's warfighting capability more effective, which ultimately shortened the conflict and saved lives by hastening victory. That is perhaps the best that can be said of any weapon. It worked when it was needed, it did what it was designed to do, and when the war ended, the world was better off for its existence. The Hedgehog's story is history now, but its legacy lives on in every anti-submarine weapons system that followed. in every tactical doctrine that emphasizes maintained contact and rapid engagement, and in the lesson that seemingly impossible problems can be solved when necessity meets ingenuity. The development of the Hedgehog had also spurred parallel innovations in anti-submarine warfare that deserve examination. The success of the forward-throwing principle led to experiments with larger weapons and different delivery systems. The most significant of these was Squid, which entered service in 1943. Where Hedgehog fired 24 small projectiles, Squid fired 3 massive depth bombs, each weighing nearly 400 pounds with 200 pounds of explosive. The key innovation was automatic depth setting based on the target's last known position from the sonar system. A mechanical computer calculated the submarine's depth and course, then set the fuses on all 3 bombs to detonate at that depth in a triangular pattern around the predicted position. The bombs were launched from fixed mortars angled forward and outward, creating a pattern about 120 feet across. Unlike Hedgehog, these were not contact-fused. They detonated at the preset depth whether they hit anything or not. This meant Squid lost one of Hedgehog's advantages, the ability to fire again immediately without disrupting sonar contact. But what Squid offered in exchange was the ability to kill a submarine through sheer hydrostatic shock, even without a direct hit. The massive charges, detonating in a tight pattern at the correct depth, created overlapping shockwaves that could crush a submarine's pressure hull or rupture critical systems. Tests against decommissioned submarines showed that a Squid pattern, detonating within about 70 feet of a submarine at depth, would cause catastrophic damage. This was a much larger kill radius than Hedgehog's requirement for direct contact. The Royal Navy fitted Squid primarily to frigates, the larger escort vessels that had the deck space and stability to handle the weapon's significant recoil. The installation required extensive modifications. The mortars were fixed installations that couldn't be trained, so the entire ship had to be aimed at the target. This demanded precise ship handling and excellent coordination between the bridge, the sonar operators, and the Squid crew. Squid achieved remarkable success rates. Over the last year of the war, it accounted for more U-boat kills per attack than even the Hedgehog. The automatic depth setting proved highly accurate, and the large charges meant that near misses were still often fatal. HMS Loch Killin sank U-333 with a single Squid attack in July 1944. The submarine had been manoeuvring at 350 feet when the 3 bombs detonated in a perfect triangle around it. The pressure hull imploded, killing all 53 crew members instantly. But Squid was more complex, more expensive, and harder to manufacture than Hedgehog. The mechanical computer required skilled technicians to maintain. The large bombs were harder to handle and store, and critically, Squid required more extensive ship modifications than Hedgehog. For these reasons, the Americans largely stuck with Hedgehog, which could be retrofitted to smaller escorts and operated with less specialized training. The British preference for Squid and American preference for Hedgehog reflected different operational philosophies and industrial capabilities. The Royal Navy, with longer experience in anti-submarine warfare and a tradition of technical sophistication, favoured the more complex but potentially more lethal system. The US Navy, building hundreds of destroyer escorts on an urgent timeline, preferred the simpler weapon that could be installed quickly and operated by crews with less specialised training. Both approaches worked. By 1944, whether an escort carried Hedgehog or Squid mattered less than the fact that it carried some form of forward-throwing weapon. Either one gave the escort a massive advantage over submarines compared to depth charges alone. The integration of these weapons with improving sonar technology created a truly deadly combination. Early war sonar, the British ASDIC and American equivalent systems, could detect submarines but provided limited information about their depth, course, and speed. Operators had to estimate these parameters based on experience and guesswork. By 1943, new sonar types provided much more detailed information. Type 147 ASDIC, entering service on British escorts, could measure target depth with reasonable accuracy. American SQS-4 sonar provided improved range and bearing resolution. These improvements meant that when a ship fired Hedgehog or Squid, the aim point was based on much better data than earlier in the war. The fire control systems evolved as well. Early Hedgehog attacks relied on the ship's captain eyeballing the target's position and ordering fire when he thought the range was right. By 1944, plotting rooms aboard larger escorts used mechanical calculators to determine optimal firing solutions. Operators would input the target's range, bearing, depth, and estimated course and speed. The calculator would output the ideal firing time and ship's heading. This scientific approach to anti-submarine warfare dramatically improved hit rates. The ammunition supply chain for these weapons was a logistical marvel in itself. Each Hedgehog projectile required precision manufacturing. The contact fuse alone contained dozens of small parts machined to tight tolerances. The Torpex explosive had to be cast into the projectile body without voids or cracks that could cause premature detonation. The tail fins had to be perfectly aligned for stable flight. Manufacturing facilities in Britain and the United States produced these complex munitions by the tens of thousands, maintaining quality control despite the wartime pressure for maximum production speed. The British facilities at Chorley in Lancashire and Bridgeon in Wales became major production centres for Hedgehog projectiles. American production was centred at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, and at private contractors like Western Electric. At peak production, these facilities were turning out over 10,000 projectiles per month. Each one was tested and inspected before being shipped to operational units. The logistics of getting ammunition to ships at sea presented its own challenges. Convoy escorts couldn't return to port every time they expended their Hedgehog loads. The Royal Navy developed techniques for replenishment at sea, with ammunition ships transferring projectiles via high line or, in calmer weather, by bringing ships alongside. This was dangerous work in the North Atlantic's heavy seas, but it was essential for maintaining escorts on station. The evolution of tactics for using forward-throwing weapons showed how military organisations adapt and learn. Early doctrine for Hedgehog attacks was tentative and defensive. Ships were instructed to fire from maximum range, then turn away if they missed to avoid overrunning the submarine's position. This made sense initially when crews were unfamiliar with the weapon, but it wasn't aggressive enough to maximise effectiveness. By mid-1943, doctrine had evolved toward the persistent attack model demonstrated by ships like HMS Westcott. Make sonar contact, close to optimal range, fire, and if you miss, immediately fire again, and again, and again. Keep the submarine under continuous attack until either it's destroyed or it reaches a depth beyond the weapon's effective range. This required nerve from captains and crews. It meant closing to ranges where a submarine could potentially hit back with a snapshot from a torpedo tube. It meant accepting the risk of collision if the submarine suddenly surfaced directly ahead. But the statistics proved that aggressive, persistent attacks succeeded far more often than cautious single-shot attempts. The training of escort crews became increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. By 1944, new destroyer escorts and frigates worked up at dedicated training bases where they practiced against friendly submarines playing the role of U-boats. These exercises revealed weaknesses in crew coordination, communication problems between the bridge and the sonar room, or mistakes in firing procedure that could be corrected before the ship faced real combat. The Western Approach's tactical unit at Liverpool became famous for its realistic and demanding training program. Escort crews would spend weeks there between operational patrols, running through simulated convoy battles where instructors threw every possible scenario at them. Submarine attacks from multiple directions, night surface attacks, coordinated wolfpack tactics, all practiced again and again until responses became automatic. Ships that completed this training showed markedly better performance on their next operational patrols. The presence of Hedgehog and Squid in these exercises was crucial. Crews learned not just how to fire the weapons, but when to fire them, how to read the tactical situation, how to coordinate with other escorts in a screen. They learned that the first salvo rarely got a kill, that patience and persistence were essential, that maintaining sonar contact mattered more than getting off a quick shot. The impact on U-boat tactics was profound and measurable. In 1942, German submarines operated with relative confidence. They surfaced at night to charge batteries and transit at higher speeds. They pressed home attacks even when escorts were nearby, confident they could escape into the blind spot and evade depth charges. By 1944, this confidence had evaporated. U-boats remained submerged longer, even when it meant depleting their batteries to dangerously low levels. They broke off attacks at the first hint of an escort closing in. They went deep immediately when detected, sacrificing their ability to attack in favour of simple survival. German submarine commanders' war diaries from late in the war make for grim reading. Repeated mentions of Allied escorts that wouldn't break off, that kept attacking for hours, that seemed to track every evasive manoeuvre. Mentions of new weapons that exploded without warning, that came from ahead instead of behind, that seemed impossible to evade. The psychological strain on U-boat crews became unsustainable. Patrols that once lasted weeks now saw submarines returning to base after days. The crews too exhausted and traumatized to continue. Medical officers reported increasing cases of combat fatigue, breakdowns, refusals to sail. The U-boat force that had been the elite of the Kriegsmarine was breaking under the relentless pressure of increasingly effective Allied anti-submarine warfare. The technological race continued even as Germany's position deteriorated. The Type 20 U-boat, entering service in 1945, represented Germany's attempt to build a submarine that could operate almost indefinitely underwater, using a massive battery capacity and streamlined hull to achieve high submerged speeds. These submarines were designed specifically to counter the Allied anti-submarine advantages. They could sprint underwater at over 16 knots, fast enough to evade most escorts. They could dive to depths beyond the effective range of Hedgehog and Squid. They carried improved sonar to detect escorts before being detected themselves. But the Type 20 arrived too late, and in too few numbers. Of the hundreds planned, only a handful became operational before the war ended, and none achieved significant success. Even these advanced submarines would have struggled against the Allied anti-submarine system as it existed in 1945. The combination of airborne radar, sonobuoys dropped from aircraft, hunter-killer groups with escort carriers, and crucially, forward-throwing weapons on numerous escorts created a layered defence that would have been difficult for even the best submarines to penetrate. The intelligence war played a crucial role that often gets overlooked when discussing anti-submarine weapons. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park could read German naval communications throughout much of the war, providing advance warning of U-boat patrol areas, intended convoy intercept points, and even individual submarine positions. This information, designated ultra and treated with extreme secrecy, allowed convoys to be routed around known submarine concentrations. But it also allowed hunter-killer groups to be positioned where U-boats were expected, creating ambush scenarios. When a Hedgehog-equipped escort group was waiting at a position where ultra-intelligence predicted a U-boat would appear, the results were often quick and decisive. The submarine, expecting to find a convoy, instead encountered escorts actively hunting for it. In these scenarios, the technological advantages of forward-throwing weapons combined with intelligence advantages to create overwhelming superiority. The Germans never realized the extent to which their communications were compromised. They attributed their increasing losses to better Allied technology and tactics, which was partly true, but missed the crucial role of broken codes. The coordination between air and surface anti-submarine forces also improved dramatically as the war progressed. Aircraft could cover vast ocean areas, detecting surface submarines with radar and attacking with depth charges or rockets. When an aircraft spotted a submarine, it would call in surface escorts to prosecute the contact. The Hedgehog-equipped escorts would arrive to find a submarine already forced underwater, damaged by air attack, and unable to surface to escape. This air-surface coordination proved devastating. Submarines had no safe place. They were vulnerable on the surface to aircraft and vulnerable underwater to escorts with forward-throwing weapons. The mid-Atlantic air gap, that area beyond the range of land-based aircraft, had been Germany's hunting ground early in the war. By 1943, escort carriers filled that gap, providing continuous air cover for convoys. These small aircraft carriers, many converted from merchant ship hulls, carried planes that could patrol around the convoy, forcing submarines to remain submerged where they were slow and blind. The Battle of the Atlantic's turning point in May 1943 represented the convergence of all these factors: increased numbers of escorts, improved training, better technology including Hedgehog, and improved sonar, air cover from escort carriers and very long-range patrol aircraft, and ultra-intelligence all came together to create an environment where U-boats faced impossible odds. The German Navy lost 41 submarines in May 1943, an unsustainable rate that forced Admiral Dönitz to temporarily withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. From that point forward, Germany was on the defensive in the Atlantic, never regaining the initiative. The Hedgehog's role in this victory was significant, but not solitary. It was one component of an integrated system that defeated the U-boat threat, but it was an essential component. Without effective weapons to kill submarines once detected, all the improved detection capabilities would have been futile. The Hedgehog and Squid turned detection into destruction, with a reliability that depth charges could never match. The human stories behind these statistics deserve recognition. Lieutenant Commander Pendleton and the crew of USS England became famous for their 6 submarine kills, but they represented the professionalism and skill that thousands of escort crews developed over years of hard service. The crews who loaded Hedgehog projectiles in freezing spray, who maintained complex equipment in harsh conditions, who stood watch hour after hour scanning sonar screens for the telltale echo of a submarine. These men won the Battle of the Atlantic. The technology gave them tools, but their skill, persistence, and courage determined how those tools were used. Similarly, the U-boat crews deserve recognition for their courage, even as we acknowledge they fought for a regime committing unspeakable evil. The 75% casualty rate in the U-boat service was higher than any other branch of any military in World War II. These men faced death in perhaps its most terrifying form, trapped in a steel tube as it floods and sinks into darkness. They fought knowing that their chances of survival were minimal, yet they continued to sail. The fact that their sacrifice served an unjust cause doesn't diminish their personal courage. The post-war period saw a rapid evolution in anti-submarine warfare as the Cold War began, and the Soviet Union emerged as a major submarine power. The Hedgehog remained in service through the 1950s, but new technologies soon surpassed it. Homing torpedoes, both submarine-launched and air-dropped, proved more effective than any pattern weapon. Submarines armed with nuclear weapons and capable of remaining submerged indefinitely changed the nature of anti-submarine warfare fundamentally. The hunt for Soviet missile submarines became the primary mission for Western anti-submarine forces. Long-range sonobuoy fields, nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarines, and sophisticated sonar arrays replaced convoy escorts as the primary anti-submarine tools. But the principles established by the Hedgehog remained relevant. Maintain contact with the target, use weapons that don't disrupt your sensors, create probability zones that force the target into positions where it can be engaged. These concepts, proven in the Atlantic from 1943 to 1945, continued to shape anti-submarine doctrine through the Cold War and into the present day. The technological lineage from Hedgehog to modern systems like the American ASROC, or the more recent RUM-139 vertical launch ASROC is clear. These are forward-throwing weapons that carry homing torpedoes to the target area, maintaining the principle of attacking ahead of the launching platform. The torpedo then homes on the submarine independently, using active sonar, passive acoustic tracking, or wire guidance. This represents the ultimate evolution of the Hedgehog concept, a forward-thrown weapon that autonomously guides itself to the target. The Soviet Union and later Russia developed their own versions, the RBU series of rocket launchers, some remaining in service today. These fire patterns of small rockets in salvos, much like Hedgehog, though with rocket propulsion allowing greater range. The newest versions use contact-fuzed projectiles remarkably similar in concept to the original Hedgehog rounds from 1941, proving that the basic idea remains sound 8 decades later. Modern anti-submarine helicopters also represent an evolution of forward-throwing weapons. They use dunking sonar to detect submarines, then drop homing torpedoes ahead of the submarine's projected position. The helicopter hovers, maintaining sonar contact, while the torpedo prosecutes the attack. This is the Hedgehog principle applied in 3 dimensions with 1940s technology, replaced by computers, turbine engines, and autonomous guidance, but the core concept unchanged. The economic analysis of the Hedgehog's effectiveness is striking. Each projectile cost approximately $60 to manufacture in 1943, equivalent to perhaps $1,000 in modern currency. A full load of 24 projectiles cost less than $1,500 in contemporary terms. Compare this to the cost of a depth charge, which was more expensive per unit but far less effective. Or compare it to the cost of losing a merchant ship, typically millions of dollars in cargo alone, plus the ship itself, plus the potential loss of crew. A single successful Hedgehog attack that sank a U-boat potentially saved dozens of merchant ships from being torpedoed over the submarine's remaining operational life. The return on investment was enormous. The rapid adoption and mass production of the Hedgehog demonstrated that military organizations, when facing existential threats, can identify and deploy effective solutions quickly. From initial concept in 1940 to operational deployment in 1941 to widespread service by 1943 represented remarkably fast development and deployment for a completely new weapon system. The institutional resistance that initially slowed adoption offers lessons as well. New technologies, especially those that challenge established doctrine, face inherent skepticism. Officers who had built careers around depth charge tactics naturally resisted a weapon that implied their expertise was obsolete. This is a human response, not limited to military organizations or to World War II. Overcoming that resistance required clear evidence of superior performance, advocacy from progressive leaders, and ultimately the pressure of operational necessity. The modern military technology development process, with its decade-long timelines from concept to deployment, stands in stark contrast to the urgency of World War II development. There are good reasons for more careful development, including the greater complexity of modern systems and the absence of existential threats requiring emergency measures. But there may be lessons from the Hedgehog's rapid development about the value of simpler, focused solutions to specific problems rather than complex systems trying to address every possible scenario. The Hedgehog also demonstrates the value of international cooperation in military technology. The British developed it, the Americans manufactured it in large quantities, and both nations' forces used it effectively. This free exchange of technology between allies, driven by shared necessity rather than commercial or national prestige considerations, contributed significantly to victory. Contrast this with the Axis powers, where Germany, Italy, and Japan rarely shared technology effectively and sometimes actively concealed developments from each other. The Allies' willingness to adopt the best available solution regardless of origin gave them cumulative advantages across many technologies. The cultural impact of the Battle of the Atlantic and weapons like the Hedgehog extended beyond military history. The post-war period saw numerous films, books, and documentaries exploring submarine warfare. Works like The Cruel Sea by Nicholas Montserrat, himself a corvette commander during the war, brought the experience of convoy escort duty to wide audiences. These cultural products helped establish the popular understanding of World War II naval warfare and kept the memory of the Atlantic battle alive for subsequent generations. The veterans who served on escorts, whether they used Hedgehog, Squid, or depth charges, formed associations after the war that preserved their experiences and honoured their fallen comrades. The Western approaches, veterans' organisation in Britain and similar groups in other nations kept alive the stories of men who served in conditions of extraordinary danger and hardship, often with little recognition compared to other military roles. The preservation of Hedgehog launchers and related equipment in museums serves an important function beyond mere display. These artifacts connect visitors to the reality of the Battle of the Atlantic in tangible ways. Seeing the actual weapon, understanding its size and mechanism, makes the historical accounts more concrete and comprehensible. The USS Slater in Albany, New York, with its preserved Hedgehog mount, allows visitors to stand where the weapon crew stood, to see what they saw, to imagine the moment when the order to fire came and projectiles arced into the dark Atlantic waters. Educational programs at naval museums use the Hedgehog to teach broader lessons about technology, innovation, and problem-solving under pressure. The story of its development and deployment offers case studies in effective leadership, organizational change, and the integration of new capabilities into existing forces. The environmental legacy of World War II munitions, including Hedgehog projectiles, has become an issue in recent decades. Thousands of these weapons were disposed of after the war by dumping them at sea, as was standard practice at the time. In some coastal areas, particularly around former naval bases, unexploded ordnance including Hedgehog projectiles occasionally washes ashore, or is encountered by fishing vessels or construction projects. The contact fuses, though old, can still function, making these discoveries dangerous. Bomb disposal teams regularly deal with World War II munitions, including Hedgehog rounds. The Torpex explosive has degraded over decades, becoming more unstable in some cases. The proper disposal of these artifacts requires careful handling by experts. This aspect of the Hedgehog's legacy serves as a reminder that the effects of war persist long after the fighting ends. The technical documentation of the Hedgehog and related weapons, preserved in archives, provides valuable historical records of wartime engineering and manufacturing. The detailed blueprints, test reports, and operational analyses offer insights into how problems were identified, solutions designed, and systems deployed under wartime urgency. Researchers studying innovation, technology development, and organizational change have used the Hedgehog case study extensively. Business schools have examined the DMWD's organizational structure as a model for innovation groups within larger organizations. The rapid development cycle offers lessons for modern technology companies facing competitive pressure. The importance of user feedback, demonstrated by the training programs that improved Hedgehog effectiveness, parallels modern concepts of iterative development and user-centered design. The Hedgehog story also illustrates the importance of systemic thinking. The weapon alone didn't win the Battle of the Atlantic. It was effective because it was integrated into a larger system that included improved sonar, better tactics, enhanced training, increased numbers of escorts, air cover, and intelligence advantages. No single element was sufficient, but each element amplified the others. This system's approach to military capability remains relevant today when analysing modern defence challenges. The counterfactual question of what would have happened without the Hedgehog is interesting to consider. Would the Allies have won the Battle of the Atlantic anyway, relying on numbers, air power, and intelligence? Almost certainly, yes, though it might have taken longer and cost more ships and lives. The margin of victory would have been smaller, the timeline extended, potentially affecting the timing of D-Day and subsequent operations. Or would the Germans have developed countermeasures that restored some balance to the submarine war? Possible, though by 1943 Germany's industrial and scientific capacity was increasingly strained by the Eastern Front and strategic bombing. The reality is that the Hedgehog accelerated and ensured an Allied victory that was likely inevitable, given the overwhelming industrial advantage the United States brought to the war. The personal stories of innovation behind the Hedgehog extend beyond Charles Goodeve to include the many engineers, technicians, and officers who contributed to its development. The team at the DMD included specialists in explosives, metallurgy, ballistics, hydrodynamics, and electronics, all working collaboratively on different aspects of the problem. The test crews who took prototype weapons to sea and provided feedback on their performance made crucial contributions. The ordnance factory workers who manufactured the projectiles with the precision necessary for reliable function were essential to the weapon's success. This collective effort, typical of wartime development programs, doesn't diminish the importance of leadership and vision, but it reminds us that complex systems are always the product of many hands and minds. The lessons from the Hedgehog remain relevant in the 21st century. Military organizations still struggle with the challenge of identifying and addressing capability gaps quickly. The tension between established doctrine and new approaches persists. The need for effective training to maximize the potential of new systems hasn't changed, and the fundamental principle that drove the Hedgehog's development, using technology to eliminate an adversary's tactical advantage, remains central to military competition. In an era of hypersonic missiles, autonomous weapons, cyber warfare, and space-based capabilities, the basic dynamic remains. Identify what gives your opponent an advantage. Develop technology or tactics to neutralize that advantage, integrate the new capability into your forces, and train personnel to use it effectively. The Hedgehog succeeded brilliantly at all these steps. It neutralized the U-boat's blind spot advantage, provided a reliable kill mechanism, was successfully integrated into hundreds of ships, and crews learned to use it effectively. The result was a decisive shift in the balance of naval warfare and a contribution to ultimate Allied victory. When Admiral Dönitz surrendered what remained of the U-boat force in May 1945, when the last submarines surfaced and their crews came on deck to face imprisonment, the Hedgehog could claim its share of that victory. The weapon that had seemed impossible to create, that faced institutional resistance, that required new tactics and extensive training, had proven itself one of the most effective anti-submarine weapons ever deployed. The men who operated it, from Pendleton and England's crew to thousands of other escort sailors, had transformed the technology into tactical success, and the U-boat force, which had nearly strangled Britain and brought the Allies to the brink of defeat, lay destroyed, scattered across the floor of the Atlantic, many of them victims of a weapon that looked like a porcupine and hit like a hammer. The Hedgehog's thunder had spoken, and the depths of the ocean had answered with the breaking of steel and the end of the submarine threat. That is the story of how the Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon started sinking U-boats like never before, and how it helped turn the tide in history's greatest naval battle.